too slow, but you feel like home. Yeah, you feel like home. And where you run, I will follow, 'cause you feel like home.
Hi everyone, my name is Lucy Moore, and as Chair of Right by the Sea, I want to welcome you to our 5th Right by the Sea Festival, coming to you from beautiful Kilmore-Key, County Wexford. We are delighted to be able to present an exciting programme to you, especially after the last 18 months of unprecedented challenges. Right by the Sea 2021 is the result of hard work on the part of our volunteers, plus support from our sponsors. And I want to thank especially the Arts Council of Ireland, RTE Supporting the Arts, Wexford County Council, and all our local sponsors. We sincerely hope you enjoy this event. And if you've a taste for more, please go to www.rightbythesea.ie to book other events during the festival or events that we run throughout the year. Now, I invite you to enjoy what's coming up. And I want to say thanks to you for joining us. See you all soon again.
My name is John Grace. I'm the operations manager here for the lifeboat in Kilmore-Key. We're standing outside the lifeboat station here, which has a shop attached to it. The station has been here for close to 150 years. And it's an intrinsic part of the community with generations of families involved as volunteers. We're delighted to be associated with Right by the Sea because we do offer some conference room facilities up here, and they obviously bring a lot of folk into the community, to the visitors to the community, and we're a charity, so we depend on contributions from the public and sales in the shop. It's the more people we get coming into Kilmore-Key, and some of them may spend a few bob here in the shop, and that's what we're after. And obviously, a lot of the people involved in Right by the Sea, their families are also involved in the lifeboat, because we are sort of an internet of a community.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this very special Right by the Sea event this evening. My name is Anne O'Brien, and I am delighted to welcome Colm Tóibín and Andrew O'Hagan, who will be discussing the role of memory in their recent novels. Colm Tóibín needs little introduction. An internationally renowned novelist, short story writer, essayist, playwright, journalist, critic, and poet, Colm is a native of Enniscorthy, County Wexford. Following an early career as a journalist, editor, and travel writer, Colm is the author of 10 novels, including Brooklyn, Nora Webster, and House of Names, along with 2 collections of stories. He has been 3 times shortlisted for the Booker Prize for The Blackwater Lightship in 1999, The Master 2005, and The Testament of Mary in 2012. Other work includes collections of short stories, poetry, many works of non-fiction, and editorial works. His writing has been translated into more than 30 languages. Colm has received honorary doctorates from the universities of Ulster, Dublin, East Anglia, and the Open University. He is currently a contributing editor at the London Review of Books and Mellon Professor of Humanities at Columbia University in New York. He divides his time between his homes in Dublin, New York, and Los Angeles. Colm's most recent novel, The Magician, was released in the US by Scribner Book Company on the 7th of September and by Penguin Books Limited on this side of the Atlantic on the 23rd of September 2021. Andrew O'Hagan is one of the most exciting contemporary writers in Britain today. His novel, The Illuminations, was longlisted for the 2015 Booker Prize, following 2 previous nominations for Be Near Me in 2006 and Our Fathers in 1999. He has won the Los Angeles Times Book Award and the E.M. Forster Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, among many other prizes. He is editor-at-large of the London Review of Books and visiting professor of writing at King's College, London, and is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Andrew was born in Glasgow, grew up in North Ayrshire, studied at the University of Strathclyde, and now lives between London and Edinburgh. He writes regularly for the London Review of Books, where, among many other places, his heart-rending essay, The Tower on the Grenfell Fire, is published. Andrew's most recent novel, Mayflies, published in 2020, is now out in paperback from Faber and Faber. And now, without further delay, I hand you over to Colm and Andrew for what promises to be a very interesting conversation. Colm and Andrew.
Andrew, it's great to talk to you across the Atlantic Ocean. I'm wondering if we would start just by asking you the basic question. What role does memory play in Mayflies?
I think when I first met you, Colm, and almost 30 years ago now, 25 years ago, one of the things that created a friendship between us, at least for me, was reading you and realizing that certain things were possible for the novel out of memory, not only personal memory, but as it were national memory, the sense that our respective countries have a story that sometimes need revising, that sometimes offers the opportunity to challenge again in sometimes very personal ways. And you, of course, were in the novel writing game before I was, and you were doing that. I remember seeing it in the South and in the Heather Blazing. It was after the Heather Blazing that I first met you. And a couple of years after that, I wrote my first book, The Missing. And then Our Fathers. Certainly for me, memory was always there, I think, in all the writers that I admired. The relationship between memory and imagination was the key one. That was true of Robert Louis Stevenson. It was true of Henry James. It was true of Proust. It was true of some very contemporary writers. Irvine Welsh, it's true of, that the lives that we lived in the past and the life that the country lived, the experiences we'd been through both together and apart, seemed to me in the DNA of the novel as a form. I've always felt that.
Just specifically in the novel, because it deals with two time frames, then you're actually playing with time. You're actually saying, this is what is remembered and this is what's experienced. And then one gets refracted by another, so that in Mayflies it isn't, I mean, it must have been tempting in Mayflies just to say, let us just go back to that period, that golden weekend, and leave it at that. And then you think, no, actually, because the way it's remembered is what gives it its power. Yes, it was experienced in a certain way, but it was remembered, and that remembering gives it a sort of density. So just wondered if you could talk us through the technical questions that arose then of having a novel with a very large gap between the two time frames.
You know how it is, Colm, sometimes, nearly all times for us, the structure's incredibly worked for. It's part of the process of envisioning and re-envisioning the book, dealing with the prose, looking at the time frame, dealing with the question of the development of character. It changes your sense of the structure of the book. But now and again, I don't know if it happened to you with The Master. I mean, we'll come to The Magician in a minute, but I always meant to ask you if there had been a sense of, as it were, the different periods in James's life. I still think about the ending of that book in Rye, the journey suggested from the train station back up to the house. The question of structure and time, again, for us, I suppose, is everything. To answer your question about this book, for once, perhaps never again, this idea was born with the structure in place. I knew from the minute that I conceived of Mayflies, which is drawn, I mean, I don't hesitate to say, and as you know, drawn very much from recent events in the life of my friends and myself, not long ago events or childhood events, but recent events as well as long ago events. The recent events, in a sense, gave me the key or the access to past events in a new way. That's something we could possibly have talked about in the past, but you knew Keith Martin, who was the direct inspiration for Tully Dawson in this novel. He was a very striking figure. We all felt that. But what was unavailable to me before his illness and his death was how he would be transmuted when the opportunity came to write fiction. He, in a sense, he became invested with all sorts of feeling that I wasn't sure he was invested with for me in life. He meant a great deal to me, but I wasn't sure that he was mythological. And I think that's one of the things that happens. But the structure came automatically. I understood, and it was to do with, if you'll allow me this, to do with symbolism. When I had made the journey to Dignitas and saw, as I looked out from the window, were the people elect to die there.
Could you just explain to us what Dignitas?
Yes, of course. So in the novel, I don't think I'm giving away a terrible surprise when I say that the central character in this book has terminal cancer. And we travel in the first half of the book back into 1986, where the boys were young. They didn't realize it as we don't realize it, but it was we were at the height of our youth. At this particular weekend, a bunch of Scottish boys went to Manchester to see a bunch of bands. It seemed like the most important weekend in terms of seeing the bands, but actually what it was, I realized 30 years later, 40 years later, is that it was the height of our youth. And that's the first half of the book. The second half is this journey with one of the boys and one of the friends, the narrator, as they realize that he's not going to make it. And there's that last year. And of course, dignity in dying, loyalty, responsibility, all of these things are live issues for these two guys and for all of them. So there's a journey towards the possibility of Dignitas, which is an organization, for those viewers who don't know, in Switzerland, which offers the service of assisted dying. Of course, it's illegal in the United Kingdom and in many of our countries and in Ireland, but is under review, if you like. It's coming before the Scottish Parliament very soon, and I'm patron of Dignity in Dying in Scotland. We're very much keen to get this onto the statute books. A sort of enlightened attitude towards end-of-life care, but that's a whole other issue. In the novel, it comes up as a strong theme and indeed a direction, a possible direction. I won't say how it goes in the end, but I'll tell you that I went to Dignitas in Switzerland, and I was in the room at one point, as we often are, Colm, in the course of our research or experiencing these things with a book in mind. And I looked out of the window. It's a small room full of Indian throws, and in the bed, covered in a yellow blanket, where people lie down and take the two small cups that will end their life. And when I looked out the window, I saw just at the end of the garden a little football field with white goals at each end. And my great friend Keith was a football fan all his life, and so is Tully in the book. And when I saw those goalposts, I realized, in a way that any novelist will understand, and possibly many readers too, that that symbol, that strong image, gave the book its structure. I knew the book would have to take in, as it were, that image from that window, as well as it were, the goalposts of his childhood. And there, with the two halves, football being a game of two halves, it all seemed to fit quite naturally together. And I trusted them, Colm, in that way that I think you're one of the people who I first heard speaking about this in relation to Cézanne. Once you were speaking about what's not in the picture and how the eye of the viewer will indeed complete the image. That was something I remember you saying, perhaps at the National Gallery a dozen years ago. And of course, those of us who are novelists understand exactly what that means. And I understood that the gap, the 30-year gap between the two halves of the book would never have to be filled in with little incidents of them meeting up when they were at university, or meeting up during the early noughties, or meeting in a pub in Glasgow sometime in 2013. I knew you wouldn't have to do that because the intelligent reader would make the leap. They would fill all those years, just as we do when we meet someone in the street that we haven't seen since school. You know what I mean? I mean, that causes me to want to ask you something. And if I can start with the master, just since I mentioned it, did you have a structure in terms of memory, the memory of the places, your Venice, your Rye, your England, your Ireland? Did you have a sense when you started that book of just how it would move in and out of the past? Or did that come as a surprise to you?
I did think that I would take just those 5 years in Henry James's life, 1895 to 1900. He's in his 50s. He has moved to Rye, which is probably a mistake in that there's no one like him in that town. He has a very nice house. He has servants, but there's no. In London, he had a great social life, but he felt he had too great a social life, so he wanted solitude. Well, he certainly got solitude. So these are 5 years when nothing much is working. He writes one great story, The Turn of the Screw, but nothing else. He fails in the theatre. Some of the stories fail, a novel fails. It looks as though he's come to an end.
Was the failing in the theatre of Guy Domville always there as a theme?
He puts on a play. I mean, I've been there where you just realise at the opening night, oh no, all the hopes. But the hopes you have.
I mean, you weren't there. You were nominated for a Tony, as I remember.
I know, but it was. Look, I had a situation where you're in Sardi's, which is the highest pinnacle opening. Your opening night on Broadway, you're in Sardi's, which is the place you go to after the opening.
Yeah.
Everyone's there. You have no idea who's not, like, and it's the most fashionable night. And you're standing in the middle of the room with your back to the door, and someone just says to you, the review in the New York Times is not great. And when you turn, everyone behind you has already left. Not just without saying goodnight, but without making a sound. They have simply dissolved into the New York night. Literally every single person, and the other people only have left because they have to get by you. And that is just so embarrassing and so difficult that they're sort of turning and wriggling. And yeah, I've been there. But this happened, oddly enough, after I wrote the book. So I have these 5 years. And I know what's coming, which is that he's going to write 3 great novels, 3 years. The Ambassadors, The Wings of the Dove, The Golden Bowl. He's going to have, really all this, the payoff for this solitude is going to be enormous. But here he is, and he's haunted by various things that have happened in the past. And so you do flashback, and then the problem is how much flashback you do. And at one stage when I was teaching creative writing, I used to ban flashbacking. No flashbacks. Tell the story, go A, B, C, D, and then, and don't go. That morning as you woke, you remembered an event 30 years earlier. Don't do it. Just imply it, stop it. Flashbacking must end. Jane Austen doesn't do it. How come she doesn't do it? Because she's right not to do it. Like she did.
Except it's incredibly effective when it works.
What happened to Mark? When did this flashbacking business start?
Well, in The Master, I mean, if you didn't have that sense of time slightly shifting, actually it mimics consciousness, doesn't it? Yeah. That
at the same time, I did it so much in The Master that I didn't do it at all in Brooklyn.
You're done with it.
Just moves ahead. The odd time she remembers something, but it's a tiny image. Whereas in The Master, you have to constantly watch yourself, though, not to overdo it, not to have this sort of soft focus on the screen from, from a fully lit scene to soft focus, that you do in films, so you can move it back into the past. But so that for James, everything that had passed was a sort of an erosion.
Yeah.
The time itself moving, the death of his parents, the childhood, the moving from one house to another, was always a sense that every time time moved, he lost something. And the work became an effort to recover that, which I think is something that happens in fiction, where you think, that house that I lived in is gone. The only person who would ever be able to build it back is me in a novel. And there's an intensity in the way you work. And you can see it in certain writers, not only, like Proust or Joyce, but someone like John McGahern. Where was the tree? Where was the shadow? Where was the door? Where was the car seat used as a chair? That all of those things become extraordinarily infused with this intensity.
I think that's extraordinary in Brooklyn. The texture of Brooklyn seems to me absolutely singular in that, and I would ask you this, it feels like, as it were, somebody moving forward, moving towards an America, but a sense of reconstructing an Ireland, a past, all the time. That in a sense, it becomes more vivid, like someone stepping back from a large canvas in a gallery and really seeing the makeup of it suddenly. And I felt that always with Brooklyn, and I wondered how much of that is you. I mean, I'm not asking you autobiographical questions. We can take that or leave it. But was there a sense technically that you could, did you have resources available about distance from Ireland?
So, I mean, it was autobiographical in the sense that I had just been in Texas for I know Texas is getting a very bad name, and rightly, but I had been in Texas for 3 or 4 months, and I really wanted to go home at the end of it. And so it was coming up to Christmas, and it's that Irish feeling of, I'm going home for Christmas.
Yeah.
And would wake in the morning, especially in the morning, and just think, I wish I was in Ireland now. I could turn on Morning Ireland. I could go down and even Brennan's Bread, like things you don't even like, you know, that you could, the big ad breaks that come, the loud, really strident ad breaks that come on Irish radio, ended up missing. And when I came home, I had this tiny detail on another thing I was writing about this woman who went to America, a young woman. And suddenly this is what I want to write now, that the emotion of that business of leaving, and as you say, where the country you leave becomes a funny sort of memory, something you miss, but not something you possess. You miss but don't possess. And the way in which it begins to fade for you means that some things also become more real than they were when you were living them. So you've got all this mixture of things in memory. And just to go back, another memory that people have as writers is the books you've read, as well as the experiences you've had.
Yeah.
Reading becomes part of experience. So in the first half of Mayflies, it is as though you're taking a sort of Scottish moment, which is a lot of young men decide to go drinking and there's music. And what you decide to do is you take them to England and you think, oh, right. So if this is, well, let's take Irving Welsh. Take Janice Galloway, take any of the Scottish writers of sort of your generation. And you think the first thing they're going to do is get arrested. They're going to vomit. They're going to beat one another up. They're going to have a fight with the police. And you'd actually decide not to do that. And it seems to me to be another way where memory functions. Say, no, I remember these images, that this is the set image, as though set in concrete, of the Scottish, the sort of narrative arc of the Scottish.
I'm trying to rehabilitate the reputation of the whole nation.
What?
I'm trying to rehabilitate the Scots, that after years of these drunken, acid-involved, sort of ecstasy-taking novels, I want to show that a bunch of 18-year-old boys can go to Manchester and, have a few drinks and not get arrested. Actually, joking aside, the two things that never happened to us as teenagers, we never had girlfriends and we never got arrested. And we always ironed our shirts. So there was these boys all walking about with their white, gleaming iron shirts in Manchester. And I'd never read that in a novel. I'd never read that other kind of way of being 18, which, was to love music and love each other, but not really to be taking any risks at all.
But you must have realized as you were writing this that you were breaking a mold.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, actually, I wanted to be true to the particular experience, and I think this is something that maybe viewers would want us to touch on, is how much responsibility you feel for the truth when it comes to memory. And of course, you and I would gladly say, I'm sure, none in terms of responsibility. I mean, one will feel free to depart and to go anywhere. But actually, there are sometimes things which have the grain of something better in a literary sense because they're closer to actuality. I remember, I think I told you this once, Colm, I went for the Paris Review to Provincetown to interview Norman Mailer for the Writers at Work series years ago, a few years before Norman died. And I asked him about the Executioner's Song and about the non-fiction novel in terms of memory and note-taking and structure. Why was he insistent on it being a novel when in fact it was all true and it was all reported? And he said, sometimes things are more novelistic because they're truer. And I asked him to explain that. And as he explained it, I knew what he meant. And it was that sometimes the falsely made up thing, if you'll accept that phrase, that the gratuitously invented thing in a novel is the thing that is not right in fictional terms. I really believed that about this book, that if I was going to go around boys, events and things to do, which didn't happen necessarily, or at least were only happening because I wanted them in the novel, as it were. I thought that they rang incredibly untrue when I read back, so I would cut them, and I cut them again and again. I think that's part of the rewriting, actually, is looking again at the question of what the book demands, what's the book's memory, rather than just what's one's own. And I think that's, in a sense, poets are always, I think, very good poets have that right there on a good day, is the relationship between self and the memory and the piece. as opposed to one's own memory. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, yeah. You're looking for an image, and the mind is lazy, and you think, well, I should imagine something, and then everything you imagine just seems imagined. It just seems made up in it for a novel. It just seems, yeah, it's right, but it doesn't. But for example, when I was I think the very first pieces I published, and I was trying to get an idea of a house being not exactly untidy, but that the woman of the house, they didn't do everything perfectly. So that with a large family, she just got all the knives and forks in the right number and just put them all in the middle of the table in a quick gesture. You know, there are the knives and forks down in the middle of the table, and then you took them. I put this in because, of course, it's from life. It's what happened at home. We never ever did settings. I mean, it was just would have been considered posh to do settings, and a waste of time. But on, this thing happens when my mother read it, of course, because I was so proud I had my first story. So she said, "That's me. That's." I said, "Yeah, that's right. I just used the thing." And then, of course, the whole question became, "But is the rest of the story also me?" I said, "No, the rest of it was made up. I just wanted one detail, and I just took it from you. Yeah, thank you." And there was a lot of silence, and she used to tell the story to people. You know, if I had known he was going to do that, I would have always set the places. Because the idea for people of being in a story. So that there's a funny thing that happens, and I think you probably know this certainly from Mayflies, is that there were a lot of people, there were say 3 or 4 of you there. So there were other people who are still alive who were there, and they're going to read this. And you feel sometimes, oh, I wonder what they're going to think of this bit, because I've just made up a tiny little detail that they're going to be able to say, that actually didn't happen. And you're going to say, yeah, I know, I needed something. And sometimes you need the knives and forks into the table from memory. And sometimes you don't. You need something completely made up just to fill a gap.
You're absolutely right. That's exactly.
People who were in the room with you at the time often say, I can't make this book out because 1 minute I'm absolutely there in memory. And the next minute you've made something.
There's a brilliant moment of that, actually, really illustrative moment in the story of the night, where, you know, they're in a bar. I mean, any number of things can happen in a bar. We've been in hundreds of bars. I mean, you could come up with anything to happen in this bar. But what happens in the bar happened in London, which was that we were in a club and a magician came in who as we would, I mean, we're absolutely sort of fascinated to see as a transvestite. And she performed the most wonderful magic and lived in a state, I don't even know if this comes up, I need to look back at the story of the night if it comes up, but in life, she was very conscious of people possibly noticing or saying that she was a man. But we were there that night, she performed a wonderful trick and went off, and then a year or two later, when you were looking for something to happen in that scene, that came. Why that?
We were in a bar in London late at night, and this was an extraordinary magician. I mean, she was outstanding. But I'd never seen a magician being good before. And I'm writing a novel. So what do? Waste not one. In other words, I have people in a bar. I don't want bar talk. I want something to happen that just lifts the bar out of its moment into something bigger. I think, oh, I know what I'm going to do. And I did it word for word. I mean, I didn't change anything. And I mean, she got in touch later to say, oh, what night was that? But yeah, that I needed something big that would lead. There's a real problem if you're Irish about having your characters being in a bar. Because that's where you think, oh, now there's going to be the following things are going to occur. And you think, I'm not going to do that here. This is Argentina, but also just with bar stuff, I need something else other than men doing bar talk. And
why is there so much action in terms of Irish literature? Just as a sidebar here, it is quite amusing. So much in bars and so much in kitchens. There's hardly a single Scottish play set in a kitchen. They're all set in crofts or cottages, and certainly there's some bars. But I remember spending quite a bit of time in Ireland at one time and noticing that every play I went to was in a kitchen or a bar.
Just on the business of the architecture of books and memory, that must matter to you that you inserted the life in a high rise into the body of Scottish literature, which of course, being published in London, you get an idea, yeah, this is what it was like to be in a high rise. And high rises, A, got a bad press, but B, they didn't get any press, they didn't get any fiction, they didn't get any fictional treatment much.
Mm-hmm.
So when you came to write that, you must have been aware this is a world that has not previously been described. And also, you're dealing with memory, you're dealing with that movement of Scottish people from what we might call, just a broad term, the Gorbals, meaning the inner city.
Urban Glasgow, decayed
Glasgow as well. The movement out from the inner city into this a sort of idealistic architecture created that people would have hot water, good heating, and sort of sanitary conditions. But actually, it wasn't like that. It was the high rise.
Yeah. No, that was extraordinary time, Colm, and it seemed essential to me. There was two things that weren't, broadly speaking, I mean, of course, there's some exceptions, but we always think that we're living in very enlightened times, and all the great revolutions in fiction happened, as it were, at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. But of course, there are new things, we hope, happening in the form all the time. In my little corner, one of the things I'd have to say immediately was that there were no Catholic novels in Scotland when I was growing up. And there were no novels, as you say, set in the kind of houses that we grew up in. So we neither heard the religious fervour that we experienced in our kitchens and from our mothers and fathers, and the great sectarianism that existed in the west coast of Scotland. Let me not allow you to forget. I mean, I know there's plenty of that on the other side of the water too, but we had a share of it, and it wasn't in our novels. It wasn't in Catholic novels. Neither was that sense that, as you describe it very well, there was a great exodus, a sort of purging of the old cities. The post-war tenement houses were dragged down, were knocked down. And in their place grew up these new towns, these tower blocks. And what about the people who moved in there? Did they have hearts and minds too? Did they have memory? Did they have lore? Did they have songs? And of course, that's what we do. You start out as a novelist, and it's not like you go shopping for a subject. You find it. You find it at the end of your tongue. You find it at your fingertips. And for me, those were the two immediate things. There was no mistake that my first novel, Our Fathers, is both a Catholic prayer and, as it were, the City Fathers in Glasgow. The title came straight from those two concerns I've mentioned to you. And of course, your concerns change, don't you think? I mean, has it surprised you? Can you say this? I mean, has it surprised you now that we're, have this beautiful new book of yours, The Magician? Does it surprise you that you came to be the author, as well as books set in Ireland, about Ireland, around Ireland, and about sexuality and being away from Ireland, that you would also be interested, when it came to it, through the years, in writing, as it were, from inside the minds and the lives of other writers?
Yes, I probably wouldn't have been that interested in it. And it, like everything else, it came first by what seemed like an accident. In other words, I was thinking about writing a book about Henry James. I did a radio broadcast about him, and I suddenly realized that maybe this could be treated in fiction. Yeah. Then I thought, no, I'm locked into a funny thing where I'm an Irish writer, and how would someone like me be entitled to write this book about one of the greatest, but also someone very posh, and a novel filled with duchesses and trips to Venice and stuff. And I'm from a small town, and I'm from a housing estate in a small town, and like I said, lovely leap you could make.
Yes.
And someone in London, who and I know, Peter Strauss, who was an editor then. Peter said, if you write that book, I will publish it, and I will commission it. I will sign a contract about that book. And that gave me permission to do it, which someone else, some other editor might have said, now, could you write another novel about the grim nature of Irish Catholicism, and rain, and perhaps some, a lot of abuse within a family? Like, could you do all that for us? And instead, I got permission, strangely, to write a novel about Henry James. And I had entered my own funny middle age, and I was pretty solitary then, and so I was using a lot of things about just that whole business of if you paint yourself into a corner as a writer and you spend so much time working, and you realize one day or over a period that you've actually left life alone outside, and you can't get back to it that easily. And so I was, all those things that I was dealing with in James were, to some extent, autobiographical. And it was also the whole question of displacement.
Yes.
Of James's feeling that he had lost and lost and lost various homes and houses. And so all of that became, in a way, natural, because, of course, I was dealing with certain cliches in the Irish novel, which is all about loss. It's all about, if you have something, it will be taken from you. That if you have eviction is in the background somewhere, even if it's just about being in a flat or something. So I was, in a way, I made him very melancholy, which some people said, well, he was actually quite funny in public, but I wasn't interested in him in public. I was interested in him in private. I was interested in what he was like when he was alone.
Well, in a sense, that became, although, I mean, in some ways, startlingly different writers, you and James, it became, as it were, the Jamesian heart of that book is the privacy question, the private life, which is itself, of course, not only a Jamesian notion, but a Jamesian title. You know, it's. Can I just ask you, Colm, because, I mean, here we are in the, very close to the publication, just having been published, The Magician. Why Thomas Mann? It doesn't surprise me, by the way, because if I can suggest this to you, one of the things that allowed me and others, I think, to feel completely unsurprised, a novel by you about Henry James and now about Thomas Mann should appear, is because you were doing such interesting things in the essay in relation to those writers, the relationship between the essay form and what you've been doing there, the work that you've been doing over the years, and the novels seems to me absolutely interrelated. But just give us a sense, would you, of why Thomas Mann?
The homosexuality, which when his diaries appeared, everyone realized that all along. I mean, he was the father of 6 children, but he certainly never looked at another woman in his life other than his wife. But he looked at a great number of young men. That's not enough for me. And in the same case with Henry James, where he was as a closeted homosexual, that just won't give me enough. I couldn't write a novel about Oscar Wilde, for example. That is not, the homosexuality is not enough. In Mann, what really got me first was the idea that he was a prince in Lubeck. His father owned a big business. His father was a senator. Lubeck was a commercial city. When he walked in the street as an 8-year-old, everyone knew who he was. He was the son of that family.
It's very like in Buddenbrooks, isn't it?
Yes, his father dies when he's 13 or 14, and all that's ended.
Yeah.
The family business is wound up, and they move eventually to Munich, and it's over. When he walks in the street in Munich, nobody knows who he is. And what he did then in his early 20s was he set about writing this grand novel, which if anyone hasn't read, please read it, because it's one of the great 19th century blockbuster novels called Buddenbrooks, which is a description, and not only of his own childhood in Lubeck, what's gone, the houses that are no longer owned by the family, but it goes back 3 generations, and it starts way before German reunification or German unification. And he wants to rebuild his own world. Now, I'm really interested in this, and then interested, realizing that he lived in the long 20th century. In other words, the First World War, the Second World War, the Cold War, the Munich Revolution. He was there for all of that as a figure at the side. He was not on the barricades. He was not in the trenches, and he was not in Germany, during the war. So I have him always watching almost as an outsider. But the interesting for me, the thing that made me want to write the book are the ambiguities, that he cannot be pinned down, that you can never get him right. No matter what you do with him, you can't use adjectives, no matter how many adjectives you use. And yes, I wrote 3 long pieces for the London Review of Books. As book came out about him. I reviewed 3 biographies. I mean, I used to be a nerd, and there was 3 big bricks arrived in the house, and I just sat down and read all 3 and took notes on them. And then other books came out, so that over time, I mean, that first essay I think was 1995, and so that over time, and then the other thing that really got me going were the houses. And there's a moment where, when you're thinking about memory, and then you start imagining someone else's memory. I'm standing in a place in Brazil called Paraty, and I've gone out with the Australian novelist Richard Flanagan to look at the house where Thomas Mann's mother was born, because she was Brazilian. An amazing idea, because it's the sugar trade coming from Brazil up to Lubeck, because they made marzipan in Lubeck. Anyway, we're looking at the house, and it's on the water, and these big shutters are on the house. And Richard Flanagan says, of course, the reason for the shutters is that the stars at night in the southern hemisphere, where he lives on the water, are so strong, they're so close, that they come onto the water and they light the house up as though it's day. And you need strong shutters to sleep because there's so much light coming in from starlight on the water reflected back into the house. And I immediately thought, as though it was me had been born in this house. Imagine being born here and being brought up until you're 8 or 9. And then as a young girl being taken across the ocean to Lubeck, where there's only Irish sky. It's Irish sky, and it's low, and it's mean, and it's mixtures of grey and black, and it's always going to rain. And what would that be like? And of course, immediately I got the opening of the book, the whole idea of the mother telling the children in Lubeck, this is what Brazil was like. Tell us about the stars. Oh, the stars were so bright. Tell us about the house. Tell us about the ship. Tell us about the people. And so this idea that she has a great story to tell these children, which is not really it's not a grim fairy story. It's a real story about another world that is unimaginable to them.
And this is the $6 million question, Colm. Possibly too difficult to answer, but technically the $6 million question is your father died when you were young. You've made no secret of it in your work. And here you are interested in a novelist and the loss of world that comes about with the death of the father. Is there a way that you can just give us an insight into the technicalities of that? I mean, it's not simply plastering or grafting one life onto another. It's you put it interestingly a second ago, perhaps, and it gives us a hint that you're not just expressing a memory, but you're in a sense reinventing a memory or grafting yourself into the mind of somebody having a different memory with different parameters to yours. So therefore, how are we to understand that as readers? I mean, we can enjoy it, and we do. But is there anything you can say to that?
Yeah, that there are certain moments in the book, especially early in The Magician, the novel about Thomas Mann, especially after his father dies, where you're getting a portrait of his mother as a widow. And all you have to do is go back and look at my novel, Nora Webster, which is set in Enniscorthy, which is about my mother as a widow.
Yes.
And realize, in other words, I want to draw this portrait of this woman now, viewed from the perspective of her son. I'm doing this a second time now, but I have found another way of telling that story. And the best way of describing it is actually Joan Baez. And it's the song Diamonds and Rust, which opens, well, I'll be damned, here comes your ghost again. And it's not that unusual, it's just that the moon is full, and you go, like, it won't go. That we, all of us have, and I'll come to you in a minute with this, a number, perhaps one or two, perhaps even one, essential experiences. And no matter what novel you write, they come into it.
Yes.
And so when I wrote The Testament of Mary, suddenly I have another way of telling that mother-son story. I've got a book of stories called Mothers and Sons. So that crucial experience when I was 12, and my father died in the summer, and all of the others went away, and I was left with my mother and my younger brother, and the three of us were there for 3 years. And so I watched that world in those 3 years so carefully, because of course, if it broke again, we would be fully orphaned. And it was a very fragile period emotionally. And, so that happens to Thomas Mann, oddly enough. I mean, I probably wouldn't have written the book if this hadn't happened to him as well. So I'm then, no matter what happens in the rest of the book, he's in California, where I am now. He's in Munich. That memory won't leave the book. Lubeck, of losing where he was from, at that world being swept away from him. And so he watches the world always as though the world is a very fragile place. And he writes his novels in order to rebuild it in some way to his own satisfaction.
It's an incredibly rich novel, Colm. I mean, among your best, and that's really saying something. I was in Lubeck once with our friend Neil McGregor, and we went into the Marienkirche. We were fascinated by these red brick churches everywhere in North Germany. We did a bit of a tour of them. And I remember the Marienkirche, which of course was devastatingly bombed by the Allies in in the early 40s, and the bells, the ancient bells that were in the tower, fell from the tower and half melted into the paving, and they're still there, half melted into the paving. The most incredible thing to look at. And I remember saying to Neil, as we looked at them, they must have been the bells that the man children heard in their childhood.
Yes, yes, they were. And I had to be very, again, it's another thing about detail and memory. That's not in my book because I thought it would be too easy. It would be like if you're in Paris, you have to have the Eiffel Tower.
Yes.
If you're in like the melted bells, just no one tells him about that.
Yeah.
What gets to him instead is that even when you go to that church nowadays, or to the bigger church in Lübeck, they're just singing this composer that no one else really sings anywhere else, called Buxtehude. And I love the name Buxtehude. It sounds so Northern German. And if you go in, like I went to service in the the big church, and just there's a choir singing Buxtehude, the organist is playing Buxtehude, everything is Buxtehude. And what really got me was that in that huge bombing of Lübeck, the grave of Buxtehude from the early 18th century was just blasted into smithereens. So there was no sign of that grave afterwards. And he just finds himself by accident and said, "Oh, his grave? Oh." It just seems the last thing, buildings go church. I mean, his old family house went. But that seems to really puzzle him, the fact that the bomb went down into the ground and took the bones of the dead and blasted them into dust. And so I used that as the detail because I felt the other one could have been, it's a funny business of choosing the thing to work with.
How did you decide? Let me just ask you this before we come to anything else. How did you decide with The Magician how much of, as it were, the intellectual sort of world around man? Because of course, a lot of these German exiles, brilliantly captured in Sasha Viertel's book, them in California. We won't even go into the movie makers, the directors, and so on. But those amazing German intellectuals, you must have had to make tough decisions about how much of their letters, how much of the relationships you were going to use in the book. Can you tell us about
that? Thomas Mann's wife said about him that don't ever ask him anything because he doesn't know anything more than what he's just put into the book. In other words, he did the research. He often seemed very learned, but he wasn't learned. And he just knew enough to put into the book. And I'm not learned. So the problem was what to do, as you say, in California, when all these great German intellectuals, the people who are going to form the way of writing and thinking in the post-war period, such as Adorno, such as Theodor Adorno, and Horkheimer, and you could name them all, and every university library is packed with books about them now. What am I going to do? And the answer is I had a really good try at getting 2 big chapters where Thomas Mann and Adorno discuss, culture, music, everything else. I was really proud of them because I put so much work into them, and I tried to make it novelistic. In other words, I tried to make it work as though it was happening in time. And then, unfortunately, I sent it to the editors. Just said, this really isn't working. And oh my God, I thought, I didn't think she was right. And then I read it myself and I thought, this is the worst thing. This is a writer trying to show off. I have recently read some books. And therefore, what you have to do is lighten your load. Just throw the extra cargo out of the plane and see if you can fly a bit lighter. And so, I had to leave out a great deal of stuff. I mean, I cut 50,000 words, 50,000 words from the book. And I can tell you, I must burn them soon. You would laugh. I mean, you would howl with laughter at my efforts to be a sort of German, an expert on German social thinking or
cuts in the London Review of Books, perhaps.
So once more, I'm just a small boy from a town. I want to go back just to say, if we all have 1 or 2 things to start with, and we never get more. I mean, in other words, novelists just have 1 or 2 things is on their minds. I mean, you see it in James Joyce, for example. He really becomes obsessed with sexual jealousy. And it's in The Dead, and it's in his play Exiles. And it's right through Ulysses that, Leopold Bloom is really in a state over that Blazes Boylan is having an affair with his wife. And so it's a big theme in Joyce. So just to say, just back to you to talk about just one thing, which is buildings, architectural space, the ideas put into buildings by architects, and planners, and then people living in the buildings and the distance between the two, and the drama in a way. It probably is the drama, if you'd excuse me using the word Britain, but it is, I mean, we won't be able to use it much longer, thank God, but just break all that up. But that is the dream of post-war Britain, is the idea of building.
Yeah.
That's sung by the Hasmartins, called Build.
Yeah.
And that's something that's really on your mind in almost all the books and a lot of the important essays you've written, including the Grenfell essay.
Well, thank you for noticing, Colm, because actually it has always been for me a kind of it's just a central interest. You know, I'm writing a huge novel that I've been writing for 6 years. I stopped writing it in order to write Mayflies, but I've been back on it now this last year and a half, and of heading towards the finishing post maybe in the next year. And what I realise as I look at this, at Caledonian Road, this big social novel, is that what it's really about is so many buildings, and actually how Britain has been obsessed with this notion of certain buildings for certain people. Homes for heroes was the great slogan after the Second World War, that we need to show our gratitude to these people who fought for our freedom by giving them inside bathrooms, by putting banisters into their houses, by putting double glazing. You know, everything about social life on these islands is being dominated by the question of housing, homelessness, shortages. And I've always been interested in it, and I can't walk into a building without immediately reading it, or as our friend Tom Wolfe used to say, doing a social X-ray on the house. You know, who lives here, and how did they come to live here, and what does it mean to live here, and does everyone have a bedroom of their own, all the children, and where does the nanny sleep? It's always an obsession, and I realise as a novelist that it's been one of the ways that I've tried to show an interest and perhaps reveal something about my characters. Even in Mayflies, which in some senses is a pretty straightforward story, but every time the narrator goes into his friend Tully's house, he notices another thing. With all these paintings, everybody in a working class house in Scotland in the 1970s and early 80s had a painting of a crying boy.
Yeah.
Which we all felt was a completely straightforward reflection of our lives. We're always in tears, and these crying boys were everywhere. And so I just knew that in order the way to do this kitchen where they're having their dinner, the soup that they've stolen the stuff for and that they've got his mum to make, is to focus on the crying boy. And I'm with you. I mean, sometimes a bit more explicitly, as in Our Fathers, I wanted to get the social history of that movement into those houses, and then those houses themselves being knocked down as the tower blocks were in short time. But everywhere. And certainly when it came to writing about Grenfell Tower, I felt that although I knew it was the most controversial subject in the world and people had already made their minds up about that story, as sometimes happens in contemporary life, people feel, even journalists, sometimes imagine they know the story before they've asked a question, because there's a clear image in their mind of what they want to be true. And so many people did that with Grenfell, that actually the job of going in there and trying to find out what could be said and what was being said by those residents, especially those Muslim women who I spent a whole year with. But sometimes coming back with the news and writing about buildings and writing about what happened there can be the opening up of a real can of worms, I think.
You were talking earlier about Norman Mailer, and one of the great things Mailer did, I suppose, was he blurred the line between great journalism and great fiction. And that, as you say, his book, The Executioner's Song, which is really about the life and death of Gary Gilmore, who was executed in Utah for murder, that he got that bones of that story and as much detail as he could find. He employed a researcher, and then he created this great character, Gilmore's girlfriend.
Yeah,
Nicole, like her in every possible way. So the book was a great creation, but I don't think it could have been created if he hadn't written so much great nonfiction, such a book such as The Armies of the Night, Miami, The Siege of Chicago, and his general life and reportage. In other words, he lived in the world, And if something was going on, if there was a circus, he would join it. If there was, what was going on in one book, he realizes that the Democrats the Republicans have brought an elephant in for some parade. And he meets them and thinks, I have to go down and see this elephant. This elephant is actually viewed by me. And in a way, that's a sort of novelist moment where even in your imagination, if there's an elephant, what kind of elephant? How exactly does a baby elephant look?
You're hitting on something really important here, Colm, which I don't think has quite been said about the so-called non-fiction novel. It's not been said in relation to Joan Didion or Truman Capote or Norman Mailer or any of the others, is that actually if it's in your notebook and you've got a certain kind of imagination, then it's like a memory.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And that's where it starts. You know, if you're in Grenfell Tower for a year and you've got 55 notebooks and you've interviewed 300 people, then your notebooks become like that part of your mind where things come vividly and powerfully and in color. And I think that there's a big thing in that, you know, that especially in relation to the American scene where there's so much of this kind of work's been done, and people puzzle over it. Why don't they just call it a non-fiction book? In what sense is it a novel? And it's because of the intensity of the notes as memory material, I think. Would you allow that?
You know, I'm writing a book about Thomas Mann, and there are all these biographies, and I'm using the form of biography, which is that I'm moving chronologically through his life. But a biographer has a problem, which is when you come to how did he relate to music? What was it that happened to him when he listened to Wagner or Beethoven? And I just have no problem, because I just come to a moment where I realize I'm going to have a whole chapter where his son plays the violin. And he just says to his son in California, would you get his son, his friends who are sort of a string quartet, would you play me Beethoven Opus 132? Opus 132 is a beautiful string quartet, which has a slow movement of 20 minutes, which is one of the most exquisite pieces of music ever. It's both sad and uplifting. It just couldn't be better. And he wants to hear this in his own house. And I now can get this to happen. You have to make it real. You have to get what, you know, one of the players was Romanian. What is his haircut? Like the whole business of what it's like to have your own son playing the viola. And then the music starts. And a biographer can't do what I can do now, which is just give you page after page, if I can hold it, if I can get this right, of what it's like to listen to music. And you know, his mind wanders, and his mind comes back to music. His mind wanders, his mind comes back to music.
And you do all those things that Orwell so admired in Dickens, where he said that Dickens will bring in the unnecessary fact. And suddenly that's the artistry now in this.
Now there's some novelists. There's some novelists, and we have to be nice about them, who don't ever do this. I mean, and I love looking at them, because if you want to divide things into two, there are novelists who write book reviews, essays, who go off to Africa, who will always the novel becomes an emergency, because if you don't finish it by Christmas in January, you've agreed you're going on a tour of the American South. And there are novelists who wouldn't dream of doing this, who actually write their novels in this pure way, and indeed there are poets like this. And so I just feel, but of course you can never be sure that they're not actually having the experiences strangely. In other words, that it isn't as though, even though someone like, say, Kaguya Shiguro doesn't write, he doesn't write essays, he doesn't write, but nonetheless you feel he's living in the world nonetheless. He's really alert. And I want to come to this, to what's going on in technology.
Yes.
That, I've got a robot, he could write a robot novel. Oh my God, I find it hard enough. Like I can't even do a sex scene anymore, like it's really hard, even money.
I hate to break it to you, but the whole of Ireland is waiting for your robot novel.
But that you do live in the real world. You live in the contemporary world. That for example, you've written about Julian Assange. When Grenfell happens, you should have been writing that big book of yours when Grenfell happened.
Yeah.
And what did you do? You wrote the longest article ever. But I know how much work you put into it. I mean, every day going and detailed about who lived in the next apartment, where were they that day, what was going on the next day. So, but that this will feed in. Surely this is what's feeding into this big book you're writing.
Always, yeah. I mean, it's
Julian Assange story, for example.
quite encouraging that you call it an interest in the real world, because in a sense, what we're finding with technology is that the big question is, how real is it? And is the internet actually a fiction machine? Is it a great fabulizing operation where people are pretending to be other people on social media? They're producing and starring in their own lives, but as somebody else. They're enhancing, they're taking away, they're fictionalizing. Our game that started so innocently by two men and many others besides us, looking at the world and living in it, and then combining it with made up things. Well, that sounds almost primitive now, because everybody does that.
You have a problem
with Facebook
with a contemporary novel where, oh my God, you have to put in all these emails and text messages, and you have to get the whole business of the virtual and the real. And I have to say, I'm deciding to have a cutoff point of about 1990 for anything I'm ever going to write again. On the basis, those last 30 years are just too troublesome. But you don't have that problem.
Well, I'm enjoying it, I have to tell you, because it was a gift from somewhere, the way things went. I mean, there's grave moral and social and technological and economic problems with it all. But just the thing itself, what these machines have done, what we're doing now, the fact that you can have a live conversation screen to screen across the Atlantic live. I mean, I just love it all. And with Bitcoin, that's to say cryptocurrency, the doing away with sort of notes and money. I love it all. And I love the idea that, to go back to Julian Assange for a second, that the technology can be used to question power and the assumptions that power operates under, and the lies that governments tell and the military authorities embed, that hackers and truth seekers, journalists of a very technologically minded sort, can undermine all of that. I just love the energy of it. I think it's fictive and journalistically alive. And I sort of cottoned onto it, and I'm still, in a sense, as a novelist now, that is my subject. That is what all those journalistic pieces which you kindly mentioned, they pushed me towards that. And the way you were talking before, Colm, about growth, and writers have to. I think I could be writing a book about my sad granny in Glasgow forever, and it will never leave me, and it's still there, and it's potent and present. But you grow, as I think painters do. You have your periods, and you must respond to changes in your own experience and in the world. By the way, Colm, can I show you something? This desk that I'm talking to you from has a few objects on it. It's a little den I keep with bits and bobs. We mentioned Norman Mailer a couple of times. When I went to Provincetown to see him, we went and had oysters together. And Norman had this habit where he would draw little Greek gods onto the oysters. That's Zeus, as drawn by Norman Mailer in a restaurant.
Oh, it's a great thing to have on your desk.
Cheers me up. I think we're more or less running out of time. But
yeah. Well, anyway, it's been great to talk to you, and good luck with the book. And don't go out. I mean, I have a thing called stay in your mental pajamas all day, and finish everything you start. So therefore, no more trips, no more journalism. Finish the book.
I'll promise to do that, except on the one occasion that you come to London and I can come out and we can.
That'd be very nice. That's really nice. Anyway, it's been great talking to you.
That's a lot, Colm.
Thank you very much. You take care. You take care.
Thank you, Colm and Andrew, for a wonderful expose of the role and art of memory in your writing. It has been such a privilege to share in your insights and ideas, and to be treated to a glimpse of how memory has triggered and informed the creative processes, especially in the writing of your recent novels, Mayflies and The Magician, and across your other work too. It's been a wonderful experience. Both Mayflies and The Magician are widely available now, and we recommend that you purchase them from your local independent bookshop whenever possible. The Book Centre in Wexford, one of our generous sponsors, will be happy to help. Thank you too, friends of Right by the Sea, for joining us this evening. We hope you have enjoyed yourselves and found some inspiration in this most illuminating and stimulating conversation. We look forward to seeing you soon again. Bye-bye for now.
Thank